The sound of waves brushed softly against the edge of the infinity pool, blending with the faint hum of cicadas in the Florida heat. Grace stood there barefoot, hair tangled by the sea breeze, clipboard pressed to her chest, watching her reflection ripple on the blue surface. She wasn't supposed to be seen here. Not like this. Not by him. Inside the villa, Ethan Caldwell, her boss. The kind of man who made silence feel like a command was finishing a call with New York. Numbers, deals, deadlines. That was his world. But when he stepped outside, his voice faltered. For a single heartbeat, the world of control and power stopped. Because by the pool, under the golden light of late afternoon, his assistant didn't look like an employee. She looked like something he didn't know how to name. Grace turned, startled by the sound of his footsteps. Their eyes met his, cold as glass, hers, open, unsure. Between them, the air thickened with everything unspoken. He would tell himself it was nothing, just the heat, just the light. But from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. Because sometimes, one quiet moment can unravel a lifetime of control. And this, right here by the pool, was the moment Ethan Caldwell began to lose his. The morning sun spilled across the tarmac like melted gold. Grace Miller tightened her grip on the handle of her suitcase, the Florida heat wrapping around her like a damp blanket. The air smelled of salt and jet fuel. Somewhere behind her, a gull cried a single sharp note against the endless blue sky. "Cars waiting," came the low voice behind her. Ethan Caldwell didn't look at her when he spoke. He rarely did. His sunglasses hid most of his face, but his posture straight, contained was enough to tell her that he was already thinking about the meeting ahead. Not the sand, not the sky, not her. Grace followed him across the parking lot, her flats clicking against the pavement. She moved carefully, almost soundless beside him, as if afraid to disturb the invisible air of authority that surrounded her boss. It wasn't fear, not exactly, more like respect laced with a quiet exhaustion. Inside the car, Ethan opened his laptop before the door even closed. His fingers moved across the keyboard, precise, steady, cold. Grace sat beside him, tablet in hand, pretending to scroll through notes. What she really did was watch the world outside the window, the rows of palm trees swaying, the sunlight turning the sea into a sheet of silver. Naples. Even the name sounded gentle. A place that seemed too soft for someone like Ethan Caldwell. When they reached the hotel, the bellboys hurried forward. It was the kind of place where the marble floors gleamed like mirrors and the air smelled faintly of lemongrass and money. Ethan gave brief instructions in his deep, calm tone voice of a man used to being obeyed. Grace nodded, wrote down schedules, tried to match his rhythm, though her pulse beat a little too fast. She had been his assistant for just 3 months. 3 long months of early flights, late calls, and the kind of silence that made her doubt herself. He never raised his voice, but the weight of his disapproval could fill an entire room. That afternoon, the hotel lobby was busy with guests arriving for the investment conference. Grace stayed behind while Ethan went to register their company. She sorted through folders, arranged name tags, made sure everything looked perfect. Her reflection caught on the polished counter windblown hair, freckles, a small coffee stain on her blouse she hadn't noticed before. She sighed quietly. Great start. Grace. When she looked up, Ethan was standing there, watching her. His gaze flicked to the stain, then back to her eyes. "Be ready in 10, he said simply, and walked away. No judgment, no emotion, just command. But something about his tone, flat, almost tired, made her wonder if, behind all that control, he ever felt anything at all. Later, in the conference hall, Grace stood behind him as he spoke to a group of investors. His voice filled the room, calm and confident, the kind of voice people trusted with their money, their future. Yet, up close, she noticed small things others didn't. The faint crease between his brows when someone disagreed, the way his hand tightened around the pen whenever conversation drifted too far from his plan. She caught herself watching him longer than necessary, tracing the outline of a man who seemed carved from stone, yet carried something fragile underneath. When the meeting ended, Ethan turned, eyes narrowing slightly. "Something wrong?" "Ms. Miller Grace blinked. "No, sir. Just thinking about the next session." "Then keep thinking about it," he said, and walked off. The words weren't cruel, but the space they left behind was colder than air conditioning. That evening, the Florida sunset painted everything in amber. Grace stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The pool glimmered under soft music from the nearby bar. Guests laughed, glasses clinked, waves whispered just beyond the dunes. For the first time all day, she let herself breathe. She slipped off her heels, toes brushing the warm tiles near the edge of the pool. Her reflection shimmered on the water, blurred, almost unreal. She looked like someone else here, someone lighter. From the terrace above, Ethan watched. He had come out to make a call but stopped when he saw her. The sharp lines of business and duty blurred in that quiet moment. The woman who spent her days organizing his life now stood barefoot, bathed in gold light, smiling faintly at her own thoughts. It did something strange to him, something he couldn't quite name. He turned away, told himself it didn't matter. She was his assistant, nothing more. But even as he walked back inside, he caught himself listening for the sound of her laugh, the soft one he had only heard once. When she'd spilled coffee on his notes and apologized 3 times in 10 seconds. Back in her room, Grace sat by the window, typing up notes for the next morning's session. Through the glass, she could see the ocean, a dark stretch that seemed endless. She thought about Ethan, about how distant he always seemed. Maybe people like him needed the walls they built. Maybe those walls were what kept them from falling apart. Still, a small part of her wished she could see what he was like when no one was watching. The next morning came wrapped in salt and sunlight. The conference continued, full of handshakes and numbers. But something subtle had shifted. Grace noticed the way Ethan's gaze lingered a moment longer when she spoke, the way his tone softened, barely. And once, when she passed him a file, their fingers brushed. Just a second, nothing more. But it felt like the sound of glass cracking, faint, yet impossible to ignore. He looked at her then, really looked, and something unreadable passed through his eyes before he turned away. Neither of them spoke about it. They didn't need to, because sometimes change doesn't announce itself. It moves quietly like the tide rising beneath your feet. And as the day faded into another warm Florida dusk, Grace found herself glancing toward the pool again, wondering if the water would remember the reflection of the girl who stood there barefoot the night before, while somewhere upstairs, Ethan Caldwell sat by his open window, the sound of waves drifting in, realizing that, for the first time in years, his thoughts weren't about business at all. They were about her. The morning light spilled through the curtains in soft, golden stripes. Grace stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching the world wake up below. From this height, the ocean stretched endlessly calm, vast, and alive. Somewhere far off, waves brushed against the sand, slow and steady, like the rhythm of a quiet heart. She liked this hour. The silence before work began, before Ethan's voice filled the air with schedules and numbers. For a moment, she could almost believe this trip was a vacation, and not another week shadowing a man who barely seemed to breathe outside of meetings. A knock on the adjoining door made her flinch. "Ms. Miller." His voice came, even through the wood low, precise and always certain. "We're meeting the investors at 8. Be ready in 20. She glanced at her watch. It was only 7:30. Of course, he was always early. Grace smiled to herself, a small, private smile, and murmured, "Yes, Mr. Caldwell." By the time they reached the conference room, he was already in his element, sharp suit, steady voice, a wall of confidence that left no room for warmth. Grace took notes quietly, keeping her eyes on the screen, though she could feel his presence beside her like static in the air. Ethan Caldwell didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. Even silence bent around him. But what Grace didn't see what no one did was the tiny hesitation when he adjusted his cufflink, or the moment he looked at the investors and then away, as if human connection were a language he'd forgotten how to speak. To him, emotion was a weakness. He had learned that long ago. Control was safety. Precision was peace. And yet, lately, something about the way Grace existed soft, unguarded, too willing to laugh at small things had started to disturb the careful symmetry of his world. When the meeting ended, he turned to her. Prepare the next session file for tomorrow, and order lunch for 2. She blinked, surprised. For 2? Yes. His gaze met hers for the briefest second. We'll be working through lunch. The words sounded practical enough, but the air between them tightened, as if both knew there was more beneath that simple instruction. At noon, they sat on the balcony of the hotel restaurant overlooking the beach. Seagulls wheeled above the waves, and the scent of lemon and salt carried in the breeze. Grace placed her notepad on the table, though the pages fluttered uselessly. Ethan was reading a report, jaw set, the sunlight catching in his hair. She studied him quietly, tracing the outline of a man she saw every day but hardly knew at all. He must have felt her gaze because he looked up suddenly. Their eyes met. "You're staring," he said. Grace flushed. "I was just wondering how you can read with that glare." Ethan followed her glance toward the sunlight and shifted his seat slightly. "You get used to discomfort when you stop expecting comfort." The sentence hung there, heavy and strange. Grace didn't know how to answer, so she didn't. Instead, she reached for her drink, fingers brushing the cool glass, and said softly, "Maybe that's not something you should get used to." He looked at her then, really looked, as if the words had caught him off guard. Her tone wasn't challenging, it was kind, almost sorrowful, and something in his chest tightened, though he didn't understand why. They ate in near silence after that, broken only by the sound of waves below and the distant laughter of tourists. But every now and then, Ethan's gaze would drift toward her, curious, unsettled. Grace had that effect on people. She was simple, yes, but not small. There was a quiet confidence in the way she existed, like the sea calm on the surface, yet endless underneath. That evening, after hours of back-to-back meetings, Grace found herself alone by the pool. The sky had turned a soft coral, the water reflecting streaks of orange and rose. She slipped off her heels and dipped her toes into the cool water, feeling it move gently against her skin. From the terrace above, Ethan watched again. He didn't mean to, but his feet had brought him there. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the strange calm that came whenever she was near. He thought about the investors, the figures, the polished smiles that filled his day, and then about her, standing there barefoot, hair catching the evening light, smiling at nothing. The contrast hit him harder than he expected. He had built his life on order, yet she embodied everything that couldn't be contained: soft edges, quiet laughter, the courage to simply be. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something like envy. When she turned and saw him, she froze for a heartbeat. He looked almost human in that fading light, less like a man made of marble, more like someone who had once known how to feel. "Beautiful evening," she said, breaking the silence. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." Her voice softened. "You don't let yourself enjoy it much, do you?" Ethan's lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile. "Enjoyment is overrated." Grace tilted her head, studying him. "No, it's just forgotten." The words brushed against him like wind over water, gentle, but impossible to ignore. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The sound of the sea filled the silence, steady and endless. Grace felt it, first the shift, the quiet recognition that something was changing between them. A line drawn for so long had begun to blur. When she finally left, he stayed behind, staring at the pool's surface. The reflection of the stars trembled there, distorted and uncertain. He saw his own face in that moving water, a man who'd always believed he was untouchable. But now, the stillness inside him had ripples, and he knew something fragile had begun. He didn't yet know what it was, only that when the night wind passed, carrying with it a faint trace of her perfume and laughter, he found himself wishing the morning would come slowly. Morning light poured through the glass walls of the conference suite, soft and golden. Outside, the ocean shimmered quietly, as if holding its breath. Inside, everything smelled faintly of paper, polished wood, and tea. Grace stood near the small table, carefully arranging a tray, 2 cups, a teapot, a plate of lemon slices. Her hands were steady, but her mind wasn't. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him on the terrace the night before, his face softened by moonlight, that unreadable look in his eyes. She told herself it didn't mean anything. He was her boss. This was work. But the thought lingered like the echo of a whisper. Grace. His voice startled her. Ethan was standing by the window, sleeves rolled to his forearms, tie slightly loosened. He looked almost human like that, less perfect. She swallowed hard and lifted the tray. Tea, sir, Earl Grey, just how you like it? He turned. Their eyes met briefly. Then he nodded. Thank you. She crossed the room, every step careful, her pulse quickening. She set the tray down, poured the tea, and reached for the lemon. That's when it happened. The cup tilted. Hot liquid spilled across his crisp white shirt, blooming like amber on snow. Oh my God, Grace gasped, frozen for half a second before grabbing a napkin. I'm so sorry, Mr. Caldwell. Oh no, please hold still. Ethan inhaled sharply, startled more by her panic than the heat. He looked down at himself, then at her, flustered, dabbing furiously at his chest with trembling hands. She was talking so fast he couldn't get a word in. I'll pay for the cleaning, or buy you a new shirt, or do billionaires dry clean their souls too? I mean... She stopped, realizing what she just said. The silence that followed felt eternal. Then, to her disbelief, he laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. It started low, almost reluctant, then grew warmer, fuller. His head dropped slightly, one hand brushing his temple as though he couldn't believe it himself. Did you just ask if I dry clean my soul? Grace blinked, stunned. That came out wrong. Ethan's shoulders shook as the sound escaped again. Quieter now, real. A laugh that didn't belong to the cold CEO she worked for. For a moment, he looked younger, softer, alive. Grace couldn't help it. She laughed too. The tension in the room melted like sugar in tea. 2 people caught in an ordinary accident that somehow didn't feel ordinary at all. When their laughter faded, Ethan looked at her differently. You know, Ms. Miller, you're the first person to spill anything on me in years. I'll try not to make it a habit, she said. Cheeks pink. Don't, he replied, but the corners of his mouth still curved. Though I'll admit, it's refreshing. For the rest of the morning, something subtle had changed. The silence between them wasn't so heavy. Grace still took notes, still followed his instructions, but now, when he spoke, his tone held a trace of warmth, like the lingering taste of lemon in tea. During lunch, while reviewing the afternoon agenda, she caught him glancing her way. What she asked, smiling. Nothing, he said quickly, then added, It's strange, hearing myself laugh in front of someone. I'd forgotten what it sounds like. Grace hesitated, then said softly, Maybe you just needed a bad cup of tea to remember. That made him smile again, small but real. Later, as they walked down the path toward the next session, sunlight danced on the pavement, flickering between the palm leaves. Their steps fell in quiet rhythm. Grace talked about the morning view, the sea turtles she'd read about nesting nearby. Ethan listened not just politely, but truly listened. It surprised her. I never noticed the ocean that way, he said after a while. To me, it's always just noise. Maybe you've been too busy controlling everything to hear it, she replied. He stopped walking. Controlling, She met his gaze. "You run your world like a clock, Mr. Caldwell. Maybe that's why silence feels safer to you than sound." Her voice was gentle, but the truth in it cut through him. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. No one talked to him like that. Not investors, not employees. Yet somehow, he didn't feel offended, only seen. That night, long after the meetings ended, Ethan stood alone on his balcony, the distant hum of the ocean below. The moonlight caught the faint stain still clinging to the edge of his cuff, a ghost of the morning's chaos. He could have changed his shirt immediately, but he hadn't. He couldn't explain why. He poured himself a drink, then paused, hearing laughter drift up from the pool area below. Her laughter. Grace was sitting by the edge, talking with another assistant, barefoot again, her feet in the water. The sound was soft, melodic, unguarded. Something in him tightened, then eased at the same time. He envied that ease, that ability to exist without armor. He took a slow sip and whispered to the night, almost to himself, "How do you do it?" Grace Miller. The waves answered in their endless rhythm. Back in her room, Grace replayed the morning in her mind, the shock, the laughter, that brief, startling look in his eyes when his guard had fallen. She touched her lips, remembering how it felt to see him human for the first time. A knock at her door startled her. It was the hotel staff, holding a small package. Inside, neatly folded, was a new blouse and a short note written in his unmistakable, tidy handwriting for the next spill. E.C. Grace laughed softly, her heart warming. She placed the note on the bedside table and whispered, "You're not as cold as you pretend to be. Are you down the hall?" Ethan turned off the lights, his mind still replaying her voice. For the first time in years, he fell asleep not thinking about numbers or deadlines, but about a moment that began with spilled tea and ended with laughter he couldn't forget. The sound lingered in his dreams, gentle and alive, like the ocean he was finally starting to hear. The last meeting of the day ended earlier than expected. The air outside still shimmered with heat, but the light had turned softer, stretched thin across the sky like melted honey. Grace gathered her folders, her notes, her careful professionalism, and for once, she didn't go straight back to her room. Something inside her craved quiet, real quiet, the kind that didn't hum with fluorescent lights or the weight of someone's expectations. So, she walked, leaving the hotel behind, following a narrow path lined with hibiscus and shells until she reached the small lake behind the resort. The lake wasn't large, but it was still, the kind of stillness that made everything around it gentler. The wind carried the scent of salt and grass, the low croak of frogs from the far side. Grace sat on a wooden bench near the water, slipped off her heels, and let her toes touch the cool edge of the shore. The surface mirrored the sky, where the sun was slowly lowering, turning clouds into threads of gold and coral. She exhaled, long and deep, feeling something uncoil inside her. For the first time since the trip began, she wasn't Grace the assistant. She was just a woman sitting by the water, watching the world soften. Up in his suite, Ethan stood by the window, reviewing emails he didn't care about. His tie hung loose around his neck. The sun was in that fleeting hour when everything looked alive, even the glass walls and palm trees. Out of habit, he looked down at the path near the lake, and there she was. He should have turned away, but he didn't. There was something about the way she sat, still but not stiff, her hair moving slightly in the wind, her silhouette outlined in gold. She wasn't posing, wasn't trying to be seen. She was just there, present, alive. Without quite realizing it, he closed the laptop, set it aside, and walked out. No jacket, no phone, no reason he could explain. Just a pull quiet, irrational, strong. By the time he reached the path, the air had cooled. He slowed his steps, not wanting to startle her. She didn't notice him at first. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon where the sky met the water, her expression calm, almost wistful. He watched her reflection ripple with the faint breeze, saw how the light bent around her, how every movement she made seemed to belong perfectly to the world around her. It unsettled him, the ease of it. He'd spent his life chasing control, yet here was someone who didn't need to chase anything to be at peace. Grace sensed the shift of air behind her before she heard him. She turned, startled, then smiled softly when she saw who it was. "Didn't think you were the type to go for evening walks? Mr. Caldwell." He stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets. "Neither did I." She gestured toward the lake. "It's beautiful here. Doesn't look real, does it?" Ethan followed her gaze. The water caught the last of the sun, turning it into a mirror of fire and glass. "No," he said quietly, "it doesn't." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the gentle lap of water against the shore, the faint hum of cicadas starting their evening chorus. Then Grace said, almost to herself, "It's strange. I spend all day inside rooms full of people talking about the future, but out here, it feels like time just stops." Ethan looked at her, the curve of her cheek catching the light. "You like that?" She nodded. "I think sometimes we forget to stop. We keep building, planning, running, until one day we realize we don't remember what peace feels like." He didn't reply right away, but her words sank into him like the slow settling of dust. Peace. It had been years since he'd thought about that word. She turned toward him, smiling faintly. "You should try it sometime." He almost laughed. "I wouldn't know where to start." "Then start here," she said, eyes glinting with quiet amusement. "Just breathe." He looked at her again. Really looked, and for reasons he couldn't name, he did as she said. He inhaled, letting the air fill his lungs, tasting salt and warmth. And as he exhaled, something unfamiliar loosened in his chest. Grace's smile deepened. "See? Not that hard." Ethan's lips twitched. "Don't get used to it." "I won't," she teased softly. "But it suits you." The sun dipped lower, painting everything in amber. Grace tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her hand brushing the edge of her collarbone. Ethan's eyes followed the motion before he caught himself. He turned toward the lake, clearing his throat, but the heat in his face betrayed him. She noticed, but said nothing. Instead, she rose, smoothing the skirt of her dress. "I should go back before it gets dark." He nodded, but didn't move. She took a few steps down the path, then stopped and looked back at him. The fading light made her eyes shimmer like the lake itself. "You coming?" He hesitated. "In a minute." She smiled. "Don't stay too long. The mosquitoes here have no respect for billionaires." He chuckled softly, and for a fleeting moment, it felt natural, easy. She walked away, her footsteps light against the gravel until she disappeared around the curve of the path. Ethan stayed. The sun slipped below the horizon, and the first evening star appeared, faint and small. The lake had turned to glass now, reflecting the deep blue of the coming night. He could still see where she'd sat, the slight impression on the bench, the faint outline of her toes in the sand. He stood there for a long time, until the sky grew dark. When he finally turned to leave, the wind carried the faint scent of jasmine from the gardens below. It reminded him of her shampoo, the way she'd brushed her hair aside when she laughed. He paused, looking once more toward the place where she had been, and whispered something he barely meant to say. Maybe peace isn't found. Maybe it's followed. And though no one was there to hear it, the lake seemed to understand. Its surface rippled gently, as if answering him. Back inside his suite, Ethan sat by the window, his reflection blurred against the night. For years, the world had felt predictable sharp edges, clear lines, everything under control. But tonight, as he watched the moon rise over the still water, he realized something had shifted. The edges were softer now, and somewhere in the quiet, he felt the faint, undeniable pull of change like the first ripple before a tide. The next morning arrived wrapped in light so bright it almost hurt to look at. Waves shimmered like silver scales beneath the rising sun, and laughter floated up from the beach where guests were already gathering for the day's activities. Grace stood near the hotel's open terrace, her notebook tucked under one arm, waiting for Ethan to finish a quick call with New York. She could hear the clipped tone of his voice, the sharp control in every syllable. Same Ethan, same walls. Yet something inside her still carried the warmth from last evening by the lake, the quiet peace that had made her forget who he was for just a little while. When the call ended, he glanced her way. "You can take the morning off," he said, slipping his phone into his pocket. "I'll handle the investor briefing myself." Grace blinked. "Are you sure?" He nodded without meeting her eyes. "You've earned a break." It was unusual for him, almost suspiciously kind, but she didn't argue. She thanked him, grabbed a sun hat, and walked toward the beach. The sand was soft, warm under her feet. The sea stretched endlessly, glittering beneath a cloudless sky. She breathed in the salt air, smiling to herself. For once, she didn't have to think about schedules or meetings, just the sound of the waves. Near the resort's diving station, a group of guests gathered around a young man with a bright smile and sun-bleached hair. He was introducing himself as Liam, one of the local diving instructors. His voice carried easily, full of laughter. Grace stopped to listen. He noticed her right away. "Hey there," he said, his grin widening. "You look like you could use a bit of adventure." Grace laughed softly. "Adventure usually gets me fired." Liam chuckled. "Then maybe just a little adventure. No contracts, no risks. Just the ocean." He handed her a pair of snorkeling goggles, teasing lightly. "You ever seen the reefs here? They're like another world." Something about his openness made her relax. She shook her head. "No, I haven't." "Then you should," he said. "I can show you. It's my job, after all." The way he said it, so casual, so unassuming, made her smile. They started talking about the sea, the fish, the strange calmness that came from being underwater. Grace found herself laughing more than she had in months. Not far away, Ethan had just stepped out of the main hall, sunglasses in hand. He was looking for her, though he'd told himself he wasn't. From the terrace, his eyes caught the movement of her figure on the sand, the tilt of her head as she laughed. He followed her gaze to the man beside her. The air around him seemed to thicken. He watched the stranger hand her something snorkeling gear and the easy way she accepted it. Her laughter carried up through the air, soft and bright. Ethan felt something ignite in his chest, hot and sharp. It startled him. It didn't make sense. He tried to look away, but he couldn't. When Grace turned slightly, the sunlight caught her face. She was smiling openly, freely, a kind of smile he had never seen directed at him. Something twisted deep in his stomach. He didn't recognize the feeling at first. It was too messy, too human. Jealousy. He hated the word even in thought. It sounded small, childish. But there it was, burning quietly under his ribs. He felt it in the clench of his jaw, the sudden stiffness of his hands. The stranger said something, and Grace laughed again. Ethan started walking before he even realized it, cutting across the sand toward them. His shoes sank slightly with each step. The sunlight felt harsher now, the air too warm. When Grace saw him approaching, she blinked, surprised. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, straightening a little. "I thought you were in a meeting. It ended early," he said flatly, though that wasn't true. His eyes flicked toward Liam, measuring, unreadable. "Are you busy?" Liam smiled politely. "We were just talking about snorkeling. You should try it sometime. Great way to relax." Ethan's gaze was cool. "I prefer to breathe air, not salt water." The tension was sharp enough to cut through the breeze. Grace felt her cheeks heat up. "Liam was just telling me about the reefs. They sound incredible." Ethan turned to her, voice calm but distant. "We have a schedule this afternoon. Don't wander too far." Her smile faltered. "I thought you said I could have the morning off." "You did," he said. "It's almost noon." For a second. Their eyes locked, hers puzzled, his unreadable. Liam cleared his throat, sensing the shift. Well, it was nice meeting you. Grace, maybe another time. She nodded, offering a small, apologetic smile before turning back to Ethan. Was that really necessary? He didn't answer right away. He looked past her, toward the horizon, his expression tight. You're here on business, he said finally. I was just talking, she said quietly. You make it sound like a crime. Her tone stung more than he expected. He started to reply, but the words wouldn't come out right. Grace shook her head. You know, sometimes it's okay to let people be kind to you without thinking it means something. Then she walked away, the sand soft under her steps, leaving him standing there in silence. For a long moment, Ethan stayed rooted to the spot. The sound of the waves filled the emptiness she left behind. He hated how wrong it felt, how the light seemed dimmer now, how the easy rhythm of the morning had shattered over something so simple. He turned toward the water, watching the ripples catch the sun. The reflection of his face stared back, fractured and uncertain. He didn't like what he saw. Why had it bothered him so much? She was free to talk to whoever she wanted. He told himself that again and again. But logic did nothing to cool the burn in his chest. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the world turned to gold, he saw her again sitting at a small table near the pool, reading. She didn't look up when he passed. She didn't need to. He could feel the distance between them now, quiet but unmistakable. He stopped for a second, hands deep in his pockets, watching the way the fading light brushed against her hair, the same golden light that had once made him still inside. Now, it only made him ache. He turned away before she could notice him, his steps slow, uncertain. The night came softly, carrying the hum of the sea. Ethan stood by his window later, the glass cool beneath his hand. Down below, the water shimmered faintly under the moonlight. He remembered the sound of her laughter with that young man, bright and unguarded, and though he didn't know why, he whispered to the empty room, I don't like this feeling. But the truth was deeper than he could admit. He didn't just dislike it, he feared it. Because for the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell wasn't in control. The storm didn't begin with shouting. It began with silence, the kind that builds under your skin, heavy and electric, waiting for something, anything to strike. The door to the suite clicked shut behind them. Grace set her tablet on the desk, her movements quiet but sharp. Ethan followed, every step too controlled, too deliberate, like he was walking through a minefield of his own making. Outside, the Florida sun was already fading, casting long amber lines across the room. But inside, the air was thick with something else, unspoken words and wounded pride. She didn't look at him at first. I'm sorry if talking to someone on the beach ruined your schedule, she said, her tone even but trembling at the edges. Ethan took a breath. It wasn't about the schedule. Grace turned. Then what was it about? He hesitated, fingers tightening around the back of a chair. You're here representing the company. You can't just, what she cut in, her voice rising a little. Smile, talk to people. Breathe, his jaw clenched. It's about professionalism. She let out a small, incredulous laugh. Professionalism. He was a diving instructor. Ethan, not a rival investor. You make it sound like I was flirting on company time. He didn't answer, because maybe that was exactly how it had felt to him. Her voice softened. You think I embarrassed you. He looked away, the silence between them louder than any argument. Forget it, he muttered. No, she said, stepping closer. Say it. You were angry, but not because of me. You were angry because... She stopped herself, seeing the flash in his eyes. Because what Ethan turned then, sharp and sudden, because it bothered me, he said. The words came out rough, like they'd scraped their way out of him. Because I didn't like seeing you with him. The confession hung in the air. Trembling, Grace blinked, startled. For a heartbeat, she didn't know what to feel, shock, confusion, maybe a flicker of something else she didn't dare name. You didn't like it, she repeated quietly. He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. Forget I said that, but she didn't. She couldn't. The calm in her voice wavered. Ethan, you can't talk to me like I belong to you. You're my boss, that's all. He exhaled sharply, the sound halfway between a sigh and a laugh. I know that. Do you? He looked up. Their eyes met hers, bright and steady, his dark and restless. I know what I'm supposed to feel, he said, and what I'm not supposed to. Grace's heart tightened. She wanted to ask what that meant, but the words caught in her throat. The silence stretched again. Outside, a distant roll of thunder rumbled over the water, soft but certain. The light in the room dimmed, turning the space between them into a shadowed kind of intimacy neither had planned. Finally, she said quietly, you can't control everything, Ethan, not people, not feelings. His voice dropped, rough and low. You think I don't know that? She took a step closer, her voice barely above a whisper. Then why are you so afraid to just feel something? He didn't answer, because she was right, because somewhere between logic and longing, he had started to lose his grip. He turned away, toward the window, watching the rain start to fall, thin lines streaking down the glass. His reflection stared back at him, the man everyone saw, untouchable, precise. But the longer he looked, the less sure he was who that man really was. Grace watched him quietly. The room smelled faintly of rain now, clean and sharp. She wanted to say something to ease the tension, to pull him back, but the words felt too fragile for the weight of the moment. Instead, she said softly, you don't have to explain. Ethan. But next time you're angry, try not to take it out on someone who's just trying to help you breathe. He turned, eyes meeting hers again. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before, vulnerability, raw and unguarded. It was gone a second later, buried beneath the familiar calm. I'll keep that in mind, he said. It should have ended there. But neither of them moved. The rain grew heavier, drumming softly against the glass. The air between them shifted, full of things unsaid, what he wanted to admit, what she wanted to believe. Grace looked away first. She picked up her tablet from the desk, fingers trembling just enough to betray her calm. I'll see you at dinner, she said. He nodded once. Grace. She paused, waiting. He started to speak, then stopped. Never mind. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked toward the door. When it closed behind her, the sound echoed through the quiet room, final but not finished. Ethan stood there alone, the rain still falling in steady rhythm. He pressed a hand against the glass, watching the blurred outline of palm trees sway in the wind. His chest felt too tight, his mind too loud. He wanted to believe this was nothing, just frustration, just stress. But deep down, he knew better. This wasn't about professionalism or control or even jealousy. It was about her, the way she looked at him without fear, the way she made silence feel like something that could heal instead of suffocate. He closed his eyes, letting the sound of the rain fill the emptiness. Somewhere inside that storm of thought, a quiet truth began to form, unwelcome, undeniable. He was falling, and he didn't know how to stop. The thunder rolled again, distant and low, like the echo of something coming closer. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the air heavy and bright, the kind of stillness that comes after a storm when everything feels fragile, newly washed. Grace arrived at the conference room early, as she always did. The smell of coffee and wet palm trees drifted through the open balcony doors. She straightened the papers on the table, adjusted the projector, made herself small within the rhythm of her tasks. It was easier that way, easier than remembering how he had looked at her last night, or the silence that followed. When Ethan walked in, she kept her eyes on her notes. "Good morning," she said softly. He paused at the doorway. Morning, that was all. 2 syllables, cautious, measured, the same man, the same voice. But something inside the word had changed. They went through the motions of the morning, quietly emails, calls, reminders. The unspoken hung between them, like the echo of thunder long after the rain had passed. Every now and then, Grace would glance up and catch him watching her, as if he was trying to read something in her face that he couldn't quite name. By noon, most of the day's meetings were done. Grace gathered her things, ready to retreat to her room, when his voice stopped her. "Grace!" She turned. Yes. He hesitated, just long enough for her heart to skip. "Have dinner with me tonight." Her brows lifted. "Dinner." "Yes," he said simply. "Not as my assistant, just dinner." For a moment, she didn't answer. The room was so still she could hear the distant call of a gull outside. Why, she asked quietly. He looked at her, and for once, the sharp confidence in his expression softened. "Because I think I owe you something more than an apology I never said." There was something about the way he said it, unpolished, uncertain, that caught her off guard. Grace exhaled slowly, the corner of her mouth lifting. "All right," she said. Dinner. That evening. The beach glowed beneath a fading sun. A small restaurant sat just beyond the dunes, lit by strands of golden bulbs that swayed with the breeze. Jazz music floated in the air, slow, timeless. The kind of sound that makes you forget the world for a while. Grace arrived in a simple dress the color of sand. Her hair was loose, touched by the wind. When Ethan saw her, something inside him stilled. He'd been around elegance all his life, but this quiet simplicity unsettled him in ways he didn't understand. He stood as she approached. "You look—" He stopped himself, the word hanging in the air. She smiled faintly, like someone who's not here for a meeting. His lips curved. Exactly that. They sat at a small table near the water. The waiter poured wine, the glasses catching the last light of dusk. For a while, they didn't speak much. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was calm, almost soothing. The waves whispered just beyond the sand. Ethan leaned back, watching her. "You don't like talking about yourself," he said after a while. Grace smiled. "I do. Just not with people who'll use it against me." He nodded slowly, understanding more than she expected. "That's fair." She glanced at him. "And you talk like a man who's used to being heard, but not known." That made him pause. "Is that how you see me?" "I don't know," she said softly. "Maybe I'm just guessing. Maybe you hide behind control because it's safer than being seen." Her words landed gently, but they shook something loose inside him. He didn't reply. Instead, he looked toward the ocean, the faint rhythm of waves breaking against the shore. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. "My father used to say that emotions make men weak, that if you want to survive in business or in life, you learn to turn them off." Grace listened, her gaze steady. "And did you?" "I thought I did," he said. "Until now." The air shifted. The ocean breeze carried the sound of clinking glasses and soft laughter from other tables. But here, between them, time slowed. Grace's heart caught on that confession, simple and raw. She wanted to say something, but the words felt too fragile. Instead, she reached for her glass, her fingers brushing his. The touch was brief, barely there, but it was enough to send a quiet tremor through the space between them. For a moment, neither moved. Then Ethan exhaled a small laugh, soft and almost self-mocking. "You make me forget how to keep things simple." Grace tilted her head. Maybe they were never meant to be simple. He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw warmth behind the steady composure, a flicker of something honest, something real. Dinner stretched into night. They talked about small things, books they'd half read, places they'd never been, but beneath every word ran the steady undercurrent of something neither dared name. When the plates were cleared and the music drifted into its final song, Ethan said quietly, "I didn't invite you here to talk about work." Grace smiled, half amused, half uncertain. I figured that out. I just wanted—" He stopped, searching for the right words. "To see what it feels like not to be the man everyone expects me to be." She looked at him for a long moment, then said gently, "Then maybe stop expecting yourself to be him." 2. The simplicity of it cut deeper than she knew. A breeze swept through, carrying the scent of salt and jasmine. Grace stood, brushing sand from her dress. "It's getting late." He rose too. "Let me walk you back." They walked side by side along the beach, the sound of the ocean steady beside them. Neither spoke. It wasn't the silence of distance this time. It was the silence of something fragile, growing. At the steps of the hotel, she stopped. "Thank you for dinner," she said softly. "Thank you for saying yes." Grace hesitated, then smiled. "Good night, Ethan." Her voice was soft, but his name lingered between them like a secret. He watched her walk inside, her figure fading beneath the soft yellow light of the corridor. For a moment, he stood there, hands in his pockets, feeling the sand shift beneath his feet. He should have gone back to his room, but instead, he stayed listening to the sound of the waves and the faint echo of her laughter carried by the wind. The night was warm, the stars bright, and somewhere inside him, the walls he'd built for years began, quietly, to crack. The night was warm, the kind that carried the faint scent of salt and candle wax. The sound of waves brushed softly against the shore, steady, patient. Grace sat across from Ethan at the same seaside restaurant, though tonight felt nothing like the night before. The lights were dimmer, the music slower, each note of jazz like a heartbeat between them. She could hear the clinking of glasses from a nearby table, the whisper of wind tugging gently at the white linen drapes. Yet, somehow, all of it felt distant. The only thing that seemed close was him. He hadn't said much since they sat down, just watched her, quietly, as if trying to remember her face from every possible angle. She tried to focus on her food, on the rhythm of her breathing, but the weight of his gaze kept drawing her back. When she finally looked up, he didn't look away. Their eyes met his steady, hers uncertain, and for a long, fragile moment, neither moved. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of everything unspoken, everything neither dared to name. Ethan broke it first. "You make it difficult to think," he said softly. Grace blinked. "What?" He leaned forward a little, elbows resting on the table, voice low and deliberate. "I've built my life around control, around rules, and then you come along and somehow—" He paused, searching for words. "You undo all of it." The air seemed to still. Grace felt her pulse in her throat. "I don't mean to." "I know," he said. "That's what makes it worse." A small laugh escaped her, unsure and nervous. "You say that like I've done something wrong?" He shook his head. "No, just something I can't explain." The candlelight flickered, catching the gold in his eyes. Grace tried to breathe evenly, but her chest felt tight. She had seen Ethan angry, proud, amused. But this quiet confession was something else. There was no armor, no distance, just truth. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. "You're not used to losing control, are you?" "Never," he said simply. "It terrifies me." There was a pause, long and heavy. The word terrifies lingered between them like a confession too raw to touch. Grace's voice softened. "Maybe control isn't what you think it is." He tilted his head. "What do you mean?" "Maybe it's not about keeping everything tight and contained. Maybe it's knowing when to let go." He studied her quietly, her reflection trembling in the half-filled glass between them. "And what happens when letting go means losing something you can't get back?" Her eyes met his again. "Then maybe it was never really yours. For a heartbeat." He couldn't look away. She said it gently, but it hit him like a truth he'd been running from his whole life. The faint sound of the ocean filled the silence again, a reminder that the world kept moving no matter how much he tried to stop it. He leaned back slightly, exhaling. "You talk like someone who's not afraid of falling." Grace smiled, a quiet, knowing smile. Everyone's afraid of falling. Some of us just learn to enjoy the view on the way down. He laughed then softly, but real. The sound surprised even him. He reached for his glass, more to steady himself than to drink. The faint tremor in his hand didn't go unnoticed. Grace watched him, her voice barely above a whisper. Why does this feel like we're both standing on the edge of something? Ethan's eyes lifted, meeting hers. Because we are. Time seemed to slow. The sound of music, the murmur of other voices, all of it faded into a kind of stillness that belonged only to them. For a long while, they said nothing, just sat there, held together by the quiet gravity that neither could name but both could feel. When their food arrived, it went untouched. Grace's fork rested idle beside her plate. Ethan traced a circle along the rim of his glass, lost in thought. Finally, she broke the silence. "Ethan?" she said softly. "Why me?" He looked at her as if he'd been expecting the question, yet had no answer prepared. "I don't know," he admitted. "You're not like anyone I've met. You don't want anything from me. You just are." Her smile was small, but her eyes were bright. "That's not an answer." "No," he said, his voice barely above the sound of the waves. "It's the truth." Something in the way he said it made her chest ache. She wanted to speak, to lighten the moment, but words felt too fragile. So she didn't. She just looked at him. And in the golden light of that evening, something passed between them, soft, wordless, undeniable. When the music shifted into a slower rhythm, Ethan stood. "Dance with me." Grace hesitated. "Here." He nodded, offering his hand. "Here." Her fingers trembled as they met his. The warmth of his palm, the steadiness of his touch, it all felt too much, too close. But she let him lead her, slow and careful, to the open space beside their table. They moved quietly to the music, feet sinking slightly into the sand. It wasn't graceful, but it was real. The wind played with her hair, and when she laughed softly, Ethan felt something inside him break in the gentlest way. "Grace," he murmured. She looked up at him, her face barely inches from his. "You make me forget everything that's supposed to matter," he said, "and I don't know what to do with that." She swallowed hard. "Maybe you don't have to do anything." For a moment, the world seemed to pause, just them, the sound of waves and the soft hum of music under the stars. He wanted to say something else, something that might make sense of the chaos she had stirred in him. But when he opened his mouth, no words came. Instead, he did something simpler. He exhaled, slow and quiet, and rested his forehead lightly against hers. Not a kiss, just closeness. A confession without language. The night held its breath with them. When they finally pulled apart, the music had faded into silence. Grace looked at him, eyes wide, uncertain, but there was a softness there, something that said she understood more than he realized. Ethan stepped back, his voice low. "I didn't plan any of this." "I know," she said. "That's why it feels real." He smiled faintly, almost in disbelief. "You're going to be the undoing of me, Grace Miller." She smiled back. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. And as they walked back toward the glow of the hotel, neither spoke. The night was full, their hearts unsteady. Behind them, the tide came in slowly, washing away their footprints, but not the moment. Never the moment. The night had a hush to it, the kind that made even the waves sound gentler, slower, as if the sea itself didn't want to intrude. The sand was cool beneath their feet, still holding a trace of warmth from the day. Above them, the moon hung low and full, washing everything in pale silver. Ethan walked beside Grace, their steps unhurried, their words few. The soft hiss of the ocean filled the spaces where conversation didn't need to be. He didn't know why he'd asked her to walk with him. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the way she'd looked at him earlier, steady, quiet, unafraid. But now, as the sound of their footsteps mingled with the tide, He was grateful he had. Grace carried her sandals in one hand, her hair loose and wild in the breeze. "I forgot how loud the world can be," she said softly, "and how much I miss this kind of quiet." Ethan glanced at her, the moonlight catching on her profile. "You like the quiet?" She nodded. "It tells the truth. People fill silence because they're afraid of what they'll hear in it." He looked back toward the sea. "And what do you hear?" Grace smiled faintly. "Myself, I guess. And sometimes that's enough." Her answer lingered in the air. Ethan didn't reply, but he felt it settle somewhere deep inside him, somewhere he hadn't listened to in years. A gentle wind brushed between them, carrying the scent of salt and jasmine. She shivered slightly, crossing her arms. Instinctively, he reached out and touched her elbow. Cold, she turned toward him. The distance between them was small now, too small. "I'm fine," she said quietly, but she didn't step away. He didn't either. The sound of the waves filled the pause between heartbeats. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world felt suspended. No conference, no job titles, no walls, just two people standing on the edge of something unnamed. He reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His hand lingered a second too long. Grace's breath caught. "Ethan?" Her voice was a whisper, soft and unsure. He lowered his hand but didn't move back. The tension between them was almost tangible, like the air before lightning charged, fragile, waiting. "I shouldn't," he murmured. She tilted her head, her gaze steady on his. "Why not?" "Because if I do—" He stopped, the words heavy. "I won't stop." The honesty in his voice sent a shiver through her. It wasn't a threat or even a promise, it was a confession. For a long, quiet moment, neither spoke. The moonlight painted them in soft silver and shadow, their faces close enough for her to feel the warmth of his breath. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the war between reason and something deeper. Then, slowly, he stepped back. The space between them widened, just enough for air to move again. Grace looked away first, down at the sand shifting under her feet. "You think too much," she said gently. He smiled, a tired, rueful smile. "And you feel too easily." She looked up at him again. "Maybe that's why this works." "Does it?" She didn't answer. Her silence was neither yes nor no. It was a doorway left half open. They kept walking, though the mood had changed. The air was heavier now, charged with everything that almost happened but didn't. The moon climbed higher, turning the water to glass. Their shadows stretched long and thin behind them. At one point, Grace stopped to pick up a seashell half buried in the sand. She held it out to him. "Look at this. See the crack." He leaned closer. "It's broken." She smiled softly. "No, it's lived." The simplicity of that hit him harder than it should have. He looked at her then. Really looked the way the wind lifted her hair, the light catching the curve of her lips, the quiet certainty in her eyes. She wasn't perfect. She wasn't polished. But somehow, she made everything around her seem more alive. And he wanted her. God, he wanted her. But more than that, he wanted the peace that seemed to follow her everywhere she went. They walked a little farther until the laughter and music from the resort faded behind them. The world narrowed down to just the whisper of the tide and the sound of their steps. "Do you ever wonder," Grace asked softly, "if some things are meant to happen no matter how hard we try to stop them?" Ethan glanced at her. "I used to think everything was a choice. And now I'm not so sure." The faint smile that curved her lips was tinged with sadness. "Maybe we both stopped believing in control tonight." He didn't reply. He couldn't, because she was right. Somewhere between the silence and the sea, something had shifted, the line he'd drawn so carefully between them, professional, polite, distant, had blurred beyond recognition. When they finally turned back, the lights of the resort flickered ahead like distant stars. Grace walked a few steps ahead, her hair glinting in the moonlight. Ethan watched her, hands deep in his pockets, feeling the weight of restraint heavy in his chest. At the edge of the boardwalk, she paused. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what? For not pretending this isn't real?" He met her gaze, his voice quiet. "I'm not sure what this is." She smiled, a little sad, a little knowing. "That's okay. Neither am I." They stood there for a moment longer, caught in that delicate space between confession and silence. Then she turned and walked toward the hotel, her bare feet leaving faint imprints in the sand. Ethan watched her go until she disappeared under the glow of the terrace lights. He stayed where he was, the waves brushing against his shoes, the sound of the ocean wrapping around him like a secret. He could still feel her hand in his, even though he'd never really held it. Above him, the moon was bright, the night impossibly still. And in that quiet, Ethan realized something that both comforted and terrified him. He hadn't kissed her, but in every way that mattered, he already had. Morning came quietly, the kind of morning that looks calm on the surface but hums with everything left unsaid from the night before. The Florida sun rose over the Gulf, spilling gold across the glass windows of the resort. Inside the conference hall, the air buzzed with low conversations, polite laughter, and the faint scent of coffee and polished wood. Grace arrived early, her hair pulled back neatly, her expression composed. She moved through the room with practiced grace, holding a folder in her hands like a shield. On the outside, she was every bit the professional assistant, calm, efficient, reliable, but inside, her thoughts were anything but steady. Every few moments, she caught herself glancing toward the door, waiting. Ethan walked in minutes later, crisp in a gray suit, tie perfectly in place. His presence filled the room the way weather does quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. Their eyes met for just a second, long enough for the breath between them to change. Then he nodded slightly, impersonal, like any CEO to his staff. Grace returned the gesture. The space between them felt wider than ever, yet too charged to cross. They took their seats. He spoke to the board members. She took notes, handed documents, smiled at investors. Everything ran as it should, except for the moments, those fleeting, stolen glances that neither could control, the kind where eyes met across the table and stayed there half a beat too long. By noon, the meeting adjourned. Conversation spilled into the lounge area, where a mix of languages and laughter drifted beneath the hum of jazz from the hotel's sound system. Grace moved toward the refreshment table, grateful for the small break. That's when she met him, Alejandro Torres, a Spanish investor known for his charm as much as his success. He had a smile that could disarm anyone, and a confidence that felt like sunlight. "You must be Grace," he said, his accent warm, melodic. "Ethan's assistant. Yes, I saw you during the presentation. You looked far too focused for a room full of men talking about numbers." Grace laughed softly. "I guess someone has to keep track of the details." He smiled. "Ah, the detail's the part no one notices until they fall apart. You remind me of my sister. She also keeps her world from collapsing with a smile." There was something kind and unhurried in his tone that put her at ease. They talked not about business, but about the ocean, the heat, how Florida's sunsets could make even a cynic believe in beauty. Grace found herself smiling in a way she hadn't since arriving, and that's exactly when Ethan saw them. He stood across the room, surrounded by investors, half listening to a question he'd already answered. His gaze caught on her on the way she leaned in slightly as Alejandro spoke, the way she laughed, soft and genuine. Something hot and unfamiliar coiled in his chest. It wasn't logic. It wasn't reason. It was instinct, sharp and uninvited. The man beside him said something about market expansion. Ethan nodded absently, though he heard none of it. His eyes stayed fixed on Grace, her hand brushing a loose strand of hair, the light catching the side of her face. Alejandro said something that made her laugh again. And that was the moment Ethan felt it, that flash of something raw. Jealousy? He didn't even recognize it at first. It just felt like irritation, like a low hum under his ribs. He told himself it was unprofessional, that he was only thinking about optics, perception, boundaries. But the truth was simpler. He hated seeing her smile for someone else. Grace noticed him then. Their eyes met across the room, and her smile faltered. Just for a second, she could read him too easily. The tightness in his shoulders, the stillness in his expression. That calm that wasn't calm at all. Alejandro turned to glance at Ethan. "Your boss looks like he's deciding whether to fire me or invite me to lunch." Grace chuckled softly, but her voice had changed. "He's not always easy to read." Alejandro said, lowering his voice. "Then you must be very brave to work with him." Ethan broke from the group and walked toward them, his stride measured but his pulse anything but. "Mr. Torres," he said, offering a hand. "I hope Grace isn't keeping you from the networking session." Alejandro grinned. "Not at all. She's the first person here who doesn't talk about stocks." Ethan smiled thinly. "That's probably why I keep her around." Grace looked at him, hearing the edge beneath the calm. Alejandro excused himself a moment later, shaking Ethan's hand before disappearing into the crowd. The moment he was gone, silence settled between them like a held breath. Grace spoke first. "You didn't have to do that. Interrupt. I wasn't interrupting." She gave a small, disbelieving smile. "You were—" He exhaled through his nose, the faintest sign of frustration. "I just didn't think chatting with investors about sunsets was the best use of your time." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You don't get to decide how I talk to people. Ethan?" He met her gaze, his tone colder now. "When those people could affect a deal worth 8 figures. "I think I do." Her jaw tightened. "So every moment I breathe in this place is about business." He said nothing, but the silence was answer enough. She stepped back, hurt flickering across her face before she could hide it. "You know, sometimes I forget you're human," she said quietly. "Then you remind me." He almost said something in apology, a defense. He wasn't sure which, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he turned slightly, staring out the window at the endless blue horizon. Grace left a moment later, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, fading with each step. When she was gone, Ethan's shoulders dropped. He pressed a hand to the back of his neck, exhaling hard. He didn't understand himself why the sight of her with another man had twisted something inside him so violently. It wasn't rational, it wasn't professional, but it was real. He looked out at the sea again, the sunlight glinting off the waves like scattered glass. Somewhere out there, a storm was building. He could feel it not in the air, but in himself. That night, when he passed her in the hallway, neither spoke. Their eyes met for just a second, long enough for both to know that whatever they were pretending not to feel had already grown too deep to ignore. And as Grace walked away, Ethan realized something he couldn't yet admit out loud. Control was slipping through his hands, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure he wanted it back. The night pressed soft against the glass, a curtain of salt air and moonlight. The sound of the ocean rose and fell like slow breathing, the rhythm steady, unhurried. Ethan stood on the balcony of his hotel room, one hand braced on the railing, the other wrapped around a half-finished glass of scotch. Below him, the waves curled and broke in silver arcs, catching the faint reflection of the stars. The city was quiet now, the resort lights dimmed, and the laughter from the evening crowd had long since drifted away. But inside him, nothing was still. He'd spent hours trying to work emails, reports, data, but none of it held. Every number blurred, every thought circled back to the same thing, to her, behind him. The sliding door opened with a faint click. He didn't need to turn. He knew that sound, that careful rhythm of her footsteps. "Grace, I saw your light on," she said softly, stepping out into the night air. Couldn't sleep either. He let out a small breath, the kind that was half laugh, half surrender. "Not really?" She moved to stand beside him, her elbows resting lightly on the railing. The breeze tugged at her hair, carrying the faint scent of sea and jasmine. For a while, neither spoke. They just stood there, watching the dark water shimmer under the moon. Grace was the one who broke the silence. You seemed somewhere else today. He turned his glass slowly, watching the amber light catch against the rim. Was I? Yes, she said, glancing at him. And I don't think it had much to do with business. That drew a quiet, humorless smile from him. You're perceptive. Grace, I work for you. I have to be. He didn't answer. Instead, he set the glass down on the small table beside him and stared out at the horizon. The wind picked up, sweeping a strand of her hair against his sleeve. He could have stepped back, but he didn't. Finally, he said, his voice low, you make things complicated. She looked at him, puzzled. How so? Ethan's eyes stayed on the sea. You make me forget the rules, the lines, the things that keep everything where they belong. Grace was silent for a moment. Maybe that's not a bad thing. He turned to face her now. His expression caught somewhere between frustration and vulnerability. It is when you've spent your whole life building them. The air between them tightened. She could see it in his face, the war behind his calm, the weight of something he was trying not to feel. He exhaled slowly. You make me lose control, Grace, and I hate that. Her eyes softened, though her heart stuttered at the words. Why, she asked quietly. Because control is the only thing that's ever kept me from falling apart. The confession came out like a crack in stone, quiet, but irreversible. Grace looked at him for a long moment. Then she said gently, maybe falling apart isn't the same as breaking. He frowned slightly. What do you mean? She smiled, small but certain. Sometimes it's just opening. You've built walls so high that even peace can't find its way in. Maybe control isn't protecting you anymore. Maybe it's just keeping you lonely. Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. Her words landed too close, too true. He turned back toward the horizon, his hands gripping the railing. Below, the waves rolled on dark, endless, alive. Grace stepped closer, not enough to touch, but close enough for her voice to soften into something that felt almost like warmth. You don't have to control everything, Ethan. Sometimes you just have to feel it. Let it happen. He closed his eyes. That's not who I am. She tilted her head, watching him. Then who are you when you're not pretending to be him? The question sank into the silence between them. He didn't have an answer. For once, the man who always had one didn't. She turned then, her gaze lifting to the horizon. Look at that, she whispered. The tide's coming in. He followed her eyes. The waves were closer now, reaching higher up the sand. A slow, steady rhythm, unstoppable. Natural. Grace's voice was quiet, almost carried away by the wind. You can't fight the tide. Ethan, you can only decide whether to stand in it or let it wash over you. Her words hung there, mingling with the ocean's breath. He looked at her. Really looked the way the moonlight touched her skin, the calm in her eyes, the way she stood there without needing to fill the silence. For a moment, he wanted to reach out, to brush his fingers against her cheek, to know what it felt like not to hold back. But he didn't. Instead, he said softly, you make me want things I have no right to want. Grace turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe it's not about right or wrong. Maybe it's just real. The wind rose, carrying the scent of salt and warmth, rustling the edges of her dress. He could hear his own heartbeat steady, heavy, echoing in the space between them. For a long time, they said nothing, just stood there, two silhouettes framed against the open sea, their shadows brushing but never merging. Ethan finally spoke, his voice raw. You make it sound easy. Grace smiled faintly. It's not, but neither is holding your breath forever. That broke something in him, not completely, but enough. He turned toward her, close now, his eyes tracing the curve of her face. She didn't step back. The space between them felt like the sharp edge of a decision. He wanted to close it, but he also knew that if he did, nothing would be the same. So, he just stood there, the air charged and quiet, his voice barely audible when he said, "Grace, I don't know how to be near you without losing myself." She looked at him, eyes steady, kind. Maybe that's the point. The night stretched open around them, vast and endless. Somewhere below, a wave broke harder than the rest, a sound like a heartbeat against the shore. And there, under the pale glow of the moon, two people stood on the edge of something they couldn't define, a silence that was no longer empty, a longing that finally had a name. Grace's hand brushed the railing, just inches from his. Neither reached out, neither moved away. Sometimes, the closest moments happen without a single touch, and as the wind rose around them, Ethan Caldwell finally let the silence speak, and for the first time, he listened. The sun had already slipped below the horizon when Grace stepped out onto the sand. The last streaks of gold were fading into a deep blue, and the sound of the waves came soft and rhythmic, like the slow beating of a heart. Lanterns glowed along the beach, their light flickering in the gentle wind. A small table had been set near the water, candles swaying in tall glass holders, silverware catching the faint shimmer of the sea. It was quiet intentionally so, a kind of quiet that asked you to listen not with your ears, but with your breath. She paused a few steps away, taking in the scene. It was simple, almost shy in its elegance. She knew Ethan well enough to recognize that this wasn't for show. This was him unpolished, unguarded, maybe even uncertain. He turned when he heard her approach. He wasn't in a suit tonight, just a white shirt rolled at the sleeves, dark slacks, and bare feet sinking slightly into the sand. For the first time, he looked less like a man who owned everything, and more like one who was learning what it meant to feel. "You came," he said quietly. Grace smiled, her voice just above a whisper. "You asked." He gestured toward the table. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either," she admitted, and something like a smile flickered in his eyes. They sat. The waiter, a young man with the easy grace of someone used to silence, poured wine and left them alone. The waves rolled closer, brushing the edge of the candle's reflection. For a while, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The air between them was full enough of things left unsaid, of the memory of last night's balcony, of the quiet shift that had already begun inside both of them. Grace reached for her glass. "You don't do this often, do you?" Ethan glanced at her. "Dinner on the beach. Dinner that isn't business?" He exhaled softly, almost a laugh. "You're right, I don't." "Then why now?" He looked down, turning the glass slowly between his fingers. "Because for the first time in a long time, I wanted to." The words hung there, gentle but heavy. She studied his face, strong lines softened by candlelight. The kind of stillness that wasn't cold anymore, just quiet. "You make it sound simple," she said. He shook his head. "It isn't." The sound of the ocean filled the pause. Grace looked out at the water, its surface shifting between silver and black. "You're afraid," she said softly. "Even now?" He didn't deny it. "Yes." Of what Ethan's gaze lifted to hers. Of not being the man I thought I had to be. Something in her chest tightened. "And who are you now?" He took a slow breath, eyes never leaving hers. Someone trying to figure out how to stop running from himself. The honesty in his voice was raw, unpolished. It disarmed her more than any charm could. He set his glass down and leaned forward slightly, his voice low. "Grace, when I'm around you, I don't think about control or perception or the version of me everyone else expects. You make me forget all of that." She smiled faintly, though her voice trembled. "Is that a compliment or a warning?" He paused. "Both. Maybe." The candlelight flickered between them. The ocean whispered against the sand. It felt as if the whole night were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then Ethan said softly, "I want you to know something. For the first time in my life, I'm not afraid of what I feel." Grace stared at him, the air catching in her throat. "Ethan." He shook his head slightly, as if to stop her from interrupting. "No, let me finish. I've spent years thinking emotions were weaknesses to be managed. But when I'm with you, everything feels alive, messy, real, and I don't want to fight it anymore." His voice was steady, but there was something in his eyes, something vulnerable, new. Grace's heart ached at the simplicity of it. She wanted to say something, to give that confession the response it deserved. But words felt too small for the weight of the moment. So she didn't speak. She just looked at him, the man who had once hidden behind logic and walls, and saw, maybe for the first time, the man behind all of it. He reached across the table then, his hand brushing hers. It wasn't deliberate, but it wasn't accidental either. His fingers were warm, his touch light but certain. She didn't pull away. The waves came closer, as if to listen. When he leaned toward her, it wasn't sudden. It was slow, deliberate, like a truth unfolding in the only way it could. His hand moved to her cheek, his thumb grazing her skin. Grace's breath caught. "Ethan," she whispered. He smiled softly. "Shh, just this once. Stop thinking." And then he kissed her. It was not the kind of kiss born from impulse or hunger. It was quiet, measured, tender, almost fragile. The kind that feels less like possession and more like permission. A beginning disguised as an ending. The world seemed to still around them. The waves faded into rhythm. The candles flickered. The night breathed. When they finally pulled apart, she didn't look away. His hand lingered near her face, his fingers trembling slightly. Grace's voice was quiet, but sure. "You really aren't afraid anymore." He exhaled, a small, honest smile curving his lips. "Not of this." They sat like that for a while, the silence between them full of everything words couldn't hold. Out on the horizon, the tide was turning, and somewhere deep inside both of them, something had two. Ethan glanced at her again, the corner of his mouth lifting. "For the record," he said softly, "that wasn't part of any plan." Grace laughed, a sound light and full, and the ocean carried it away. "Good," she said. "Plans never suited you anyway." He looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, his eyes didn't carry the weight of control. Just peace. The waves kept whispering, the candles flickered low, and on that quiet stretch of sand, two lives that had been moving parallel finally touched softly, like light meeting water. The night settled over the beach like a soft blanket, wrapping the world in stillness. The candles had burned low, their flames small but steady, and the ocean's rhythm had slowed to a lullaby. The air was warm and scented with salt and candle wax. Grace sat quietly beside Ethan, her bare feet buried in the sand, her pulse still unsteady from the words he'd spoken, from the kiss that had followed. Neither of them spoke for a while. The silence wasn't awkward, it was the kind that comes when words simply aren't enough. Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the dark sea merged with the darker sky. Grace watched him, the flicker of the candlelight catching on his face, softening every line, every edge. She realized, then, that this was the first time she had ever seen him without his armor, without the cool command or the distance he always carried. There was something achingly human in that, something fragile. When he finally turned to her, his voice was quiet. "Grace." She looked up. "Yes." His hand hesitated before reaching for hers. "I meant what I said. I'm not afraid anymore." Her fingers trembled in his, not from fear, but from something gentler. Trust, maybe, or hope. "You don't have to prove anything," she said softly. He smiled, faintly. "I'm not trying to prove. I'm trying to learn. The ocean answered for them, its sound steady, patient. He brushed his thumb across the back of her hand, slow and deliberate, as if memorizing it. Grace's heart ached with the weight of how new this felt. How rare it was to be seen this way, not as someone to manage or impress, but as someone simply there, breathing in the same quiet. When Ethan stood, he reached for her. "Come with me?" She hesitated, but only for a moment, then took his hand. He led her across the sand, away from the lights, toward a spot where the sea came close enough to touch their toes. The moon hung low, and the reflection on the water shimmered like broken glass. They stood there, side by side, the tide curling around their ankles. Grace closed her eyes, letting the wind tangle her hair, the sound of the waves filling the space between them. She felt him watching her. Ethan's voice came softly. "You always look like you belong here." Here she asked. In the quiet, he said, "Like you were made for it." She smiled faintly, opening her eyes. "Maybe that's because quiet never asks for more than I can give." He looked at her for a long moment, then said, almost to himself, "You don't have to give me anything." Something in the way he said it, low, careful, honest, made her chest tighten. "I know," she said, "but I want to." He turned toward her then, closer now, his hand brushing the side of her face. His touch was steady, warm, asking rather than taking. Grace tilted her head slightly, her breath catching. "Ethan," she whispered, but he didn't speak. He just watched her, as though afraid to break whatever fragile thing was unfolding between them. When he leaned in again, it wasn't a decision, it was instinct, a quiet surrender. The kiss was deeper this time, but still gentle. No rush, no demand, just the slow recognition of two people who had been holding back for too long. Grace felt herself melt into it, her hands finding the fabric of his shirt, anchoring her to the moment. The world around them, the waves, the stars, the wind blurred into a soft hum. When they finally broke apart, their foreheads rested together, breaths mingling. Ethan's voice was barely audible. "Tell me if I go too far." Her answer was a whisper. "You won't." He drew back slightly to look at her. There was something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not control, not hunger, something quieter. Reverence, maybe. They walked back toward the villa in silence, hands brushing now and then, their steps slow, unhurried. Inside, the soft light from the lanterns painted the walls gold. Ethan paused by the doorway, searching her face. "Are you sure?" he asked softly. Grace met his eyes. "Yes." He reached for her hand again, and she followed him into the room. What happened after that wasn't hurried or wild. It was quiet, like everything between them had been. He touched her like she was something fragile and rare, like each breath she took was a secret he was being trusted to keep. At one point, she caught his gaze and whispered, "I've never done this before." He froze, searching her face. "Grace, it's okay," she said quickly. "I trust you." Something in him broke at that, not out of pity, but out of awe. He'd spent his life surrounded by people who wanted something from him, power, wealth, influence. But this was trust, pure, simple, undeserved. He kissed her forehead, then her temple, then her lips again, slowly, carefully, like he was making a promise without words. Outside, the ocean kept its rhythm. The sound of the waves slipped through the open balcony doors, soft as a heartbeat. When the candles burned low and the night thinned toward morning, Grace lay quietly beside him, her head against his chest, listening to the steady rise and fall of his breathing. His arm rested around her shoulders, his touch gentle even in sleep. For a moment, she closed her eyes and let herself believe that time had stopped, that the world outside didn't exist, that it was just them, the sea, the quiet, the warmth of two people who had finally stopped running from themselves. Ethan stirred slightly, his voice rough from drowsiness. "You still awake?" "Mm-hmm," she murmured. He smiled without opening his eyes. "You're thinking, always, don't," he said softly. "Not tonight." She smiled into his shoulder. "Okay." The waves rolled on, whispering against the shore. The air smelled like salt and candle wax and the faint trace of his cologne. Grace listened to the rhythm of his heartbeat, steady and sure, and thought, so this is what safety feels like. Outside, the first faint light of dawn began to brush the horizon. Inside, two people who had built their lives around walls had, for one night, chosen to live without them. And in that quiet hour before morning, nothing else mattered. The jet descended through a blanket of gray, the sky over New York heavy and low. Rain streaked across the cabin window, blurring the skyline into a wash of light and shadow. Grace watched it in silence, her reflection faint against the glass. Behind her, the hum of the engines filled the air steady, distant, like a reminder that they were leaving something behind. Ethan sat across from her, laptop open, eyes fixed on the glowing screen. His fingers moved fast, deliberate, already caught in the rhythm of work. The man from Naples, the one who had laughed under candlelight and whispered with warmth, seemed to fade with every mile they flew closer to home. Grace folded her hands in her lap, glancing at him once, then away. She understood, in some quiet part of her, that this was who he was, a man who belonged to motion, to ambition, to control, but it didn't stop the ache. When they landed, the city greeted them with its usual indifference, cars honking, streets slick with rain, the sharp smell of asphalt after a storm. The air was cold, real, and as the black car carried them through the familiar streets, the silence between them grew heavier than it had ever been. At the office, things moved fast again. Meetings, calls, deadlines. Ethan slipped back into the world that demanded his precision. His voice was calm, efficient, his eyes unreadable. To everyone else, he was the same composed, brilliant, untouchable. But Grace saw at the flicker of hesitation before he spoke her name, the way his tone softened, then quickly hardened again. She saw him avoid her gaze during meetings, saw the distance he built, brick by brick, as if afraid the walls might crumble again. Sometimes she caught herself wondering if Naples had really happened at all. The beach, the candles, the kiss, the way his hand had trembled against hers. Maybe it had been nothing more than a fragile dream carved out of borrowed time. One afternoon, as the rain tapped lightly against the window of his office, she came in with a stack of reports. He was on the phone, voice low but clipped, eyes scanning the screen. She placed the papers on his desk and waited. He ended the call, leaned back, and sighed. "Thank you," he said, without looking up. "Ethan," she said quietly. That got his attention. He looked at her then, eyes tired, guarded. "Yes." She hesitated. "You've barely spoken to me since we got back." He straightened slightly, the shift so small it could have been mistaken for discomfort. "Things have been busy." "I know," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But we're not the same people who left for Florida." For a moment, he said nothing. His gaze flickered toward the window, where the city blurred in streaks of gray and silver. "That's exactly the problem." "Grace," he said finally. Her heart stilled. "What do you mean?" He turned back to her, his voice lower now, almost weary. "What happened there? It was real, but it doesn't belong here." The words landed like a quiet storm. She took a slow breath. "So, what do we do with it?" He looked at her for a long time, and she saw the conflict written all over his face, the part of him that wanted to reach across the desk, and the part that wouldn't allow it. "I don't know," he said finally. "But right now, I can't afford to lose focus." Grace nodded slowly. She had expected this, maybe even prepared herself for it, but it didn't make it hurt less. "You're not losing focus," she said softly. "You're losing me." He flinched, almost imperceptibly, but he didn't answer. The silence between them stretched, filling the room like fog. Grace turned toward the door, then paused. "You once said you weren't afraid anymore," she whispered. "I guess I was wrong." When the door closed behind her, Ethan didn't move for a long time. The rain outside grew heavier, streaking the glass in thin silver lines. He wanted to call her back. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that fear wasn't the reason. But he couldn't find the words. He stared at his reflection in the window, the city lights flickering over his face, and for a moment, he didn't recognize himself. That night, he stayed late at the office. The city below glowed in restless motion, yellow cabs and wet pavement shining under streetlights. He sat in silence, the hum of the building faint around him. On his desk, the reports sat neatly stacked, but his thoughts were anything but ordered. Across town, Grace sat on her couch, a blanket draped loosely over her shoulders. The apartment was small but quiet, filled with the faint hum of city noise filtering through the window. She picked up her phone more than once, then set it down again. The memories came in flashes, the warmth of his hand, the way he had looked at her under the candlelight, the sound of the ocean in the background. They were too vivid to forget, too delicate to hold. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, maybe love isn't meant to survive in daylight. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. Days passed. The distance held. At work, they moved like planets in careful orbit, close enough to feel gravity, far enough to avoid collision. The looks lingered, the pauses lengthened, but nothing more was said. Sometimes, she caught a glimpse of the man she'd known by the sea, a softness in his eyes, a hesitation before a word. But just as quickly, the mask returned. Ethan told himself it was for the best, that the life he had built couldn't afford something as unpredictable as love. But every time he saw her pass his office door, something inside him tightened. He thought about Naples at night, the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her skin against his. He thought about her saying, "I trust you." And the truth was, he still felt it. The ache, the pull, the quiet gravity that drew him toward her, no matter how far he tried to step back. But pride, fear, and habit were stronger. For now. That night, long after the lights in the building went out, he stood by the window, watching the rain fall over the city that never really slept. He whispered to himself, maybe I just don't know how to live in peace. And somewhere across town, Grace turned off her bedside lamp, whispering a different truth into the dark. Maybe love was never supposed to be easy, just real. Outside, the rain kept falling soft, steady, indifferent, and the city, like them, kept breathing in silence. The resignation letter sat on Ethan's desk for nearly an hour before he opened it. It was simple, just a few lines in Grace's handwriting. No explanation, no emotion, only gratitude and a quiet goodbye. He read it 3 times, as if the meaning might change if he looked long enough, but it didn't. The words stayed the same, final. The office around him felt suddenly unfamiliar, too sharp, too empty. He leaned back in his chair, the sound of the city faint through the tall glass windows. Somewhere below, car horns and footsteps moved through the afternoon, but all he could hear was silence. Grace was leaving. For days, he had tried to convince himself this was for the best, that she deserved a life untouched by the complications of his. That keeping distance was an act of care, not fear, but the truth came to him slowly, painfully, like sunlight creeping through a closed door. It wasn't care, it was cowardice. He had built walls his entire life, calling them strength, and now, for the first time, those walls had cost him something irreplaceable. He looked down at her letter again, his eyes tracing the neat lines of her signature. His throat tightened. Grace Miller. Even her name sounded like calm. That night, he didn't go home. He sat in the office until the lights of the city turned into a blur outside. Every memory came back, the laughter on the beach, her hand in his, the warmth of her trust, each one a quiet reminder of everything he had let slip away. When dawn broke, he made a decision. By noon, her inbox chimed with a single message from him, No subject line, no greeting, just a short sentence and an attachment. One more trip for both of us. The attachment was a flight ticket. Destination Naples, Florida, departure tomorrow. Grace stared at the screen for a long time. Her heart thudded in her chest, her breath catching between disbelief and longing. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to stay safe in the quiet she had built since coming back. But another part, the one that still remembered the sound of his laugh, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, couldn't let go. The next morning, she found herself at the airport, hands trembling as she handed over her passport. The sound of boarding announcements echoed through the terminal, each one pulling her closer to the place where everything had begun and fallen apart. When she stepped off the plane, the Florida sun hit her like a memory, warm, familiar, alive. The air smelled of salt and wind, just as it had before. There was no car waiting, no message, no directions, only a short note tucked into the pocket of her jacket, written in his hand, by the water. Same place as before. Her heart knew the way before her feet did. The path curved through white sand and whispering palms, down toward the stretch of beach where the ocean met the sky in endless blue. He was there. Ethan stood by the shoreline, his shoes abandoned in the sand, his sleeves rolled up, the wind tugging at his hair. For a moment, he didn't see her approach. He was looking out at the horizon, the same horizon that had once watched them fall in love. When he finally turned, their eyes met. Neither moved at first. The silence stretched between them, filled with everything they hadn't said. Then Grace took a breath. "You didn't have to bring me here," she said softly. "I did," he answered, his voice low, "because I couldn't let you leave thinking fear was all I had to give." She shook her head slightly, her voice trembling. "Ethan, this isn't about fear. It's about what's real and what can't survive when the world starts watching." He stepped closer, his expression raw, unguarded, then let the world watch. Her breath caught. He exhaled, glancing down for a moment before meeting her eyes again. "I thought control made me powerful," he said quietly, "but it only made me empty. And the only time I ever felt alive was when I lost it with you." The wind carried the scent of salt and sunlight between them. Grace's eyes softened. "Ethan." He closed the space between them, his voice almost breaking. "You were right. I was afraid. Not of you, of what you made me feel. Because loving you meant admitting that I needed someone, and I've spent my whole life pretending I didn't." She looked at him, her heart aching at the honesty in his face. He took another step closer, until the tide touched their feet. Then, slowly, he sank to one knee. The world seemed to still. The waves rolled and fell in slow rhythm. "Grace," he said softly, his gaze never leaving hers, "you are the mistake I never want to correct. The most beautiful wrong turn I've ever made. The only thing I got right by doing everything wrong." Her hands covered her mouth, her eyes glistening. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both apology and hope. "You once told me to stop controlling everything. I think I finally understand what you meant." She knelt down in front of him, her voice shaking. "You don't have to prove anything." "Ethan." "I know," he said quietly. "I just needed you to know. I'm not afraid anymore." The ocean whispered around them, the tide inching higher, the sun glowing like gold across the water. Grace looked into his eyes, and for the first time since they'd left Naples, she saw it, the softness, the warmth, the man who had stood beside her under the candlelight, unguarded and real. Her voice was barely a breath. "You mean that," he nodded, "with everything I am?" For a moment. They just stayed there, two figures by the edge of the world, surrounded by wind and water and memory. Then Grace reached for him. He rose, taking her hand, and she stepped into his arms. The world fell away, the noise, the distance, the months of silence. All that remained was the sound of the waves, the warmth of skin against skin, the rhythm of two hearts finding their way back. When she finally spoke, her words were soft but steady. "You're still a little bit impossible," she whispered. He smiled against her hair. Maybe, but you're the only one who ever made me want to change. The sea stretched endlessly before them, sunlight glinting like scattered diamonds. And somewhere between the past and the present, love, quiet, flawed, undeniable, found its way home. As the tide moved closer, Ethan whispered into her ear, his voice trembling with emotion. "You're the best mistake I'll ever make." Grace closed her eyes and held him tighter, the ocean wrapping its sound around them, as if sealing a promise neither of them needed to speak aloud. And for the first time in a long time, both of them felt what peace truly meant, not the kind born from control, but the kind found when you finally stop running. The chapel was small, almost hidden between the dunes, where the sea breeze carried the scent of salt and wildflowers through the open doors. It wasn't the grand ceremony people might expect for a man like Ethan Caldwell. It was quiet, just family, a few close friends, and the ocean, humming softly in the distance. Grace stood at the entrance, her dress simple and white, the lace brushing lightly against the sand. The late afternoon sun filtered through the wooden beams, painting her in gold. Ethan stood at the altar, hands clasped in front of him, his gaze steady but full of wonder, as if, even after all these years, he still couldn't believe she had chosen him. When she walked down the aisle, he smiled, not the practiced smile of a man used to boardrooms and cameras, but the kind that began deep inside and reached his eyes. And when their hands met, there was no audience anymore, no world beyond the sound of their joined breath. They didn't need vows full of promises. They had already broken and remade them in the years before. What they said was simple. "I'll keep choosing you," Grace whispered, "and I'll keep learning how," he answered. Outside, waves rolled gently against the shore, as if the ocean itself was keeping rhythm for them. Years passed, quietly and completely. Their house sat just a few miles from that same beach, white walls weathered by salt and laughter. Mornings began with the smell of coffee and sunlight spilling through the kitchen window. Afternoons were filled with the sound of small feet running down the hallway, two of them, always in pairs, always chasing each other like the sea chasing the sand. The twins had his dark hair and her eyes. They carried both their tempers and their kindness. Some days, the house was loud with laughter and arguments and toys scattered like confetti. Other days, it was just the two of them again, Grace and Ethan standing at the porch, watching the waves beyond the dunes. Ethan still worked, of course. He always would. But something in him had softened. The sharp edges that once defined him had worn smooth with time. When he came home, the first thing he reached for wasn't his phone, it was her hand. Sometimes, when the house quieted after bedtime, they'd sit together by the open window, the night air moving through the curtains. Grace would rest her head against his shoulder, and for a while, neither of them would speak. They didn't need to. The quiet between them had become its own language. One evening, years after that first trip to Naples, they returned to the same beach. The children were older now, running ahead, their laughter scattering into the wind. Grace stood barefoot at the edge of the water, her dress brushing her ankles. Ethan came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" she asked softly. He nodded against her hair. "Every day." She smiled. "You were impossible back then." He chuckled quietly. "Still am. Some days. Maybe," she teased. "But now you know how to say sorry." He laughed, a sound that had grown warmer with the years. "You taught me that." They stood there for a long time, watching the sunset sink into the horizon. The sky turned from gold to rose, then deepened into violet, the colors melting together like memory. The tide curled around their feet, gentle and cool, in the fading light. Ethan turned to her. "You know," he said, his voice lower now, softer. "For most of my life, I thought control was peace, that if I just kept everything in order, I could stay safe." Grace looked up at him, her eyes steady, waiting. "But I was wrong," he continued. "Losing control with you, that's the only kind of peace I ever wanted." Her heart ached in the sweetest way. She reached up, tracing a line across his jaw, her fingers resting there for a moment before she whispered, "And you found it?" He nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "I did." The sun dipped lower, the last light catching in her hair. Around them, the sound of the sea swelled and fell, endless and patient. A few feet away, their children were building something in the sand, a castle, maybe, or a small world of their own. Grace watched them, her eyes soft with that kind of quiet joy that doesn't need words. Ethan followed her gaze. "They have your heart," he said. "And your stubbornness," she added, smiling. He laughed again, and the sound carried easily into the wind. When the sky finally turned dark, they gathered the kids and started walking home. The lanterns along the path flickered on one by one, their glow warm against the coming night. Grace leaned into him, her head resting lightly against his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the hush of the ocean and the faint laughter of the children ahead. And in that stillness, in that moment between day and night, they both understood something simple and true, that love wasn't about grand beginnings or perfect endings. It was about staying. Through the silences, the storms, the years that blur and soften all things. Grace's hand found his, their fingers lacing together naturally, like they had always belonged that way. He looked down at her, his voice barely above a breath. "You know what I'm thinking?" She smiled. "That you're lucky." He laughed quietly. "That too, but mostly, that some mistakes are worth making." Grace leaned up, brushing a kiss against his cheek. "Then I guess we both made one worth keeping." They walked on, their shadows long on the sand, the sea whispering behind them. The night grew deeper, the stars waking one by one, scattered like promises across the sky. And in that quiet, with her hand in his and the sound of waves in the distance, Ethan knew he had finally found what he'd been searching for all his life. Not control, not perfection, just peace. Grace glanced up at him then, her eyes reflecting the last shimmer of twilight, and whispered, half to herself, half to him, "We made it." He smiled, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "We did." The sea kept breathing, the stars kept burning, and the world turned gently toward another morning. And for them, for the man who had once feared love, and the woman who taught him how to feel life, went quietly, beautifully on. As we grow older, we learn that love isn't about perfection, it's about courage. The courage to open your heart even after it's been guarded for years. The courage to be seen not as who you should be, but as who you truly are. Ethan and Grace's story reminds us that real love doesn't arrive with fireworks or grand gestures. It comes softly, in quiet forgiveness, in the willingness to listen, to stay, and to begin again. Many of us spend a lifetime trying to stay in control of our emotions, our plans, our image, but peace doesn't come from control. It comes from trust, from letting someone else see the parts of us we once hid. Love, at its truest, is not about holding on tightly, it's about growing gently together. So, perhaps the lesson is this, even after heartbreak, even after years of silence. It's never too late to love bravely, to let your guard down, to choose connection over fear, because sometimes the most beautiful part of life begins not when we are strong, but when we are finally willing to be tender. Thank you so much for spending your time here, listening to this story with an open heart. If Ethan and Grace's journey touched you, or reminded you of the quiet strength of love in your own life, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep bringing you more heartfelt stories, stories that remind us all that kindness, understanding, and love never grow old. Until next time, take care of your heart and keep believing in gentle beginnings.